See the slides? More frustrating than I am. Okay, so we're starting a new section, and I didn't print off the slides, so if I start talking about something that's really not up there, tell me to flip the slide because you have to kind of look. Y'all got the test done, right? I don't need to leave it open till 5 o'clock. You can do it by 5? Okay. Okay. Now that we have that out of the way, test will stay open till at least 5 o'clock today. Get it done. So what we're going to talk about this time is kind of an American Renaissance, religion, romanticism, and reform. If you all remember back to the Great Awakening, religion has always played a big part in American history. I mean, that was part of why we were founded. It's people seeking religious freedom. Of course, they only wanted religious freedom for their religion, but that's one of the main things that brought people over. And the Great Awakening that swept through the nation around the time, or right before the Revolution, around that time, had reinforced this idea that Americans had a special mission in the world. You know, that Puritan city on a hill, the shining example for the rest of the world. And this has actually infused our national character. We are one of the most, or at least in the 1830s, and probably in a way even today, one of the most religious nations in the world. I mean, religion plays a big role even today, but it also infused our national character with an element of perfectionism and impatience. We're supposed to be the shining example. We're supposed to be perfect. Perfection is hard to get, and when you can't get to it, that leads to impatience. But there's going to be a second Great Awakening. We're going to get to that. And this religious fervor and social idealism is going to bring about not only a second Great Awakening, but major reforms. The 1800-1850 period is going to be a period of reform movements, advances in human rights, but also a time of disappointment, cynicism, and alienation. You can't fix everything, and that's kind of what they wanted to do. We go through this a couple of different times in our history. So coming out of the revolution, we had deism, and we've talked about deism before. Deists were the ones who kind of believed that God was like a clockmaker. He made this perfect world, wound it up, and then stepped back to watch what happens. That he doesn't involve himself in people's everyday lives. Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, a lot of the revolutionary leaders believed in deism. A lot of non-deists believed they were atheists, but they did believe in a God. They just didn't believe that he was going to intervene in daily life. And it came out of the rationality of the Enlightenment that stressed the inherent goodness of man rather than depravity, encouraged social progress. Just remember back, the Enlightenment was the scientific movement, or led by the scientific movement, stressed reason over just blind faith. But out of that, you get this stress on goodness, social progress, and the promise of individual perfectibility. They're starting to shy away from this Puritan idea that everybody is depraved and sinful and doomed from the beginning unless you made God's special list. And you were one of the chosen. And, how do you know if you're chosen? You don't. But supposedly, if you acted good, everybody would think you were one of the chosen. And maybe you would buy into it too. Deism is going to increase after the revolution. The French Revolution particularly pushed it forward. Most major cities had deitistical societies. It was really a big draw for college students because it's a very liberal idea. It appeals to young people. Nobody wants to think that you're doomed, at least not in the beginning. Deists believe that reason would unlock those natural laws. We'd figure out the clockworks, and we could, basically rule the world. They reject the literal interpretation of the Bible. They're skeptical of miracles, and they question the divinity of Jesus. Believed he was a good man, but maybe not a God. They defend free speech and oppose religious coercion. So you have deism as we start into this period. There's two other religions that come out of this post-revolutionary period that are a little more mainstream and will attract kind of more of a mainstream audience. Unitarianism is the first, and this one affected congregational churches. Now, the congregational churches were Puritan churches, but they weren't the purest of the Puritan churches. They were the ones that originally thought that the Church of England could be fixed. They were not the separatists. They were not the really severe ones. But they still believed in the Calvinist predestination and human depravity. But the Enlightenment rationalism started making inroads into that. And the Boston Puritan churches were the most vulnerable for some reason. Part of that reason was Boston was very prosperous. And prosperity didn't really fit with the Puritan idea. Not that they didn't want people to succeed, but success led to materialism. Materialism was a problem for the Puritan church. But when you have money, you really kind of want to use it. I mean, what's the point of making it if you're not going to spend it and not have nice things? So the congregational churches have a problem. And a lot of these church members looked at Boston's prosperity as proof that, maybe we weren't sinners in the hands of an angry God. Maybe it's okay. And by the turn of the century, many New Englanders were embracing I'm not going to be able to say this now because I've already said it once. Unitarianism. So Unitarianism believes, they emphasize the oneness and benevolence of a loving God. So instead of an angry God holding a spider over a flame, you have a loving God who wishes you well. They believe in the inherent goodness of humankind. We're not doomed by the original sin. And they believe that reason and conscience are more important than creeds and confessions. That maybe people should just do good things because your conscience tells you to, not just because you're going through the motions of following the rituals of the church. They believe Jesus was saintly, but not divine. They believe that all people were capable of great goodness and that all people were eligible for salvation. Now that is a big change because Puritans didn't believe they didn't believe anybody was able to get salvation on their own. Salvation was a gift from God for a certain select group of people. You just didn't know who that was until you died. Now the Unitarians are saying, no. If you're good, you can be saved. The other religion was universalism. So, okay, back up a minute. Unitarianism appealed mostly to the affluent, to the rich people in Boston. Universalism attracted a different crowd. This was the religion for the working people. It was founded by an ex-Methodist clergyman in 1790. Again, it stresses the salvation of all people. So between the two religions, pretty much you were fine. The Universalists holding that God was too good to damn man, and the Unitarians insisting that man was too good to be damned. So you're getting this shift from the fire and brimstone angry God to a loving benevolent God to salvation is available for most people. And this is going to, change how things are going. And this is not to say that Puritanism is gone. There are still Puritan churches. There are also Methodist churches, Presbyterian churches. We're going to have the Baptist churches soon. Actually, we may already have Baptist churches, but the Baptists are going to get bigger. And religion was still very big. But a lot of the churches were changing. most Americans are still profoundly religious, but after the revolution, established denominations are going to give way to these newer, more democratic sects. Anglicanism became Episcopalians, mostly because Anglican is the Church of England and we just fought a war with them and we don't want their church anymore. It's going to lose membership. It's going to lose status in the South, where it has been very prominent, but it's still going to hang on. The Methodists are going to split from the Anglicans in 1784. And the Methodists are going to do something that none of the other religions do. They're going to try to convert everybody. Everybody is welcome into their church. And by everybody, I mean they're going to let women, Indians, African Americans, if you want to profess your belief in God and be part of the Methodist Church, you can. And they actively sought these people out. This is the church founded by John Wesley. They give up on Calvinism and they turn to what he called cheerful activism. They believed in not so much as like the Baptists, but they believe in missionary. That's not the right word. They believe in actively converting people. Whereas like the Presbyterians will be involved in the Second Great Awakening, but the Presbyterians are called the frozen chosen. You know, you come to the Presbyterian Church. The Presbyterian Church doesn't, seek you out. Puritans were not big on evangelism. Evangelists, that's the word I needed, evangelism. But the Methodists were. They gave up the prayer book of the Episcopalians, sang lots of hymns. By adding the African Americans, they started singing lots of spirituals. They welcomed the poor working class, and they stressed the possibility of Christian perfection on earth. Congregational and Anglican church would give way, like I said, to the Methodists, also to the Baptist. And Americans start joining Protestant churches in large numbers. The Protestant church membership increased sixfold between 1800 and 1860. But there were also fears of secularism in these churches. And that's what's really going to spark the Second Great Awakening. It's in a way started by Timothy Dwight, who was the president of Yale and the grandson of Jonathan Edwards. If you remember back, he was one of the two major players in the First Great Awakening. He feared for the youth of his college. They were getting too liberal. They were getting too comfortable. They were getting too secular. And he starts this wave of sermons and church going at Yale, and it's going to spread out. New England colleges were the first big arena of the, I probably need to change slides, of the Second Great Awakening. The backwoods of Tennessee and Kentucky are the second. And just like in the First Great Awakening, the frontiers are ripe for religion. They're frontiers. There's not a lot of people. Kind of part of the definition of the frontier. And people are lonely. And there are not churches where people, there are in some areas, but a lot of areas are more isolated. So you get these traveling frontier revivals that come to the backwoods to preach that salvation is available not just to the select few, but to everybody. The frontier revivals, much like the first round, were very dramatic and emotional. You have circuit riding preachers this round. There were some in the first, but they get really big, particularly among the Methodists this time, where they will ride from town to town and preach. Camp meetings become a big thing. And a lot of them were ecumenical, meaning it wasn't just one religion. You know, you could kind of pick and choose. You would have a big camp meeting, and I'm talking big, thousands of people would come and camp out and set up tents. They were usually held in the fall after the harvest when people had some time. It was kind of like the circus was coming to town. And it was probably just as entertaining as the circus coming to town. Many of these were unifying events where social, economic, political, even racial differences didn't matter. There was segregation, usually within the camps. Like you'd have your white camp here and your black camp here, but the church services would draw everybody together. Again, women are going to play a large role. It's one of the few areas that women could get involved. There's a lot of, if anybody is part of a church, you know, women do a lot of the background work. You know, I don't want to say grunt work, but it is kind of grunt work, like putting together the communion trays, making sure all the hymnals get put up at the end of service, that kind of stuff. Women have always played a role, but they're going to in this too, but there's also going to be women that preach, women that become circuit riders, women that lead church services in their home. The Presbyterians kind of entrenched themselves in the Scots-Irish area, the backwoods from Pennsylvania to Georgia. They worked with the Congregationalists. They came up with a plan of union in 1801, where they didn't join the two churches, but if you were part of this plan of union and you were a Presbyterian church and you couldn't find a Presbyterian minister, you could call in a congregational minister and it was okay. And vice versa. Congregational churches could call in Presbyterian ministers. It actually really increased the Presbyterian church membership because a lot of people shifted over. The one group that didn't really buy into this Enlightenment, rationalism, happy God, were the Baptists. They replaced predestination with free will, universal redemption, and adult baptism, but they didn't give up on the idea of human depravity. People weren't all good, but people could be good if they worked hard enough. You had free will that allowed you to be good. They believed in the infallibility of the Bible. So everything in the Bible is fact. They believed in equality of all before God. And the one thing that really made them stand out and appealed, particularly in rural areas, is there was no denominational hierarchy. Like the Methodists, the Congregationalists, the Presbyterians, the Anglicans, all had a church hierarchy where the church here answered to a church here. Presbyterian or Baptist churches all stood on their own. Your church was the church. And that's still, I mean, there's a Southern Baptist Association, but that's still sort of the way Baptists work. You know, the churches are all individual. And the Baptists would welcome anybody. They're going to actively recruit African Americans as well as the Methodists are. The Methodists, I have them up here again, salvation by free will. They were big on circuit riders. Francis Asbury was one of the big ones. Like, he gave a sermon a day for over a year, riding from town to town. They also will, by attracting African Americans, start the AMA Church, which was the African Methodist Church. And that is led primarily in the beginning by a man named Richard Allen. But they also they had mixed denominations as well. I got ahead of myself. So camp meetings, we've kind of gone through that. It was a social outlet for isolated rural folks. One other thing that these church groups did is they banded together to form two societies, the American Bible Society and the American Social Sunday School Union. The Bible Society handed out Bibles. That's what they did. The Sunday School Union set up Sunday schools all over the United States, even in rural areas, so that people, even if you weren't having camp meetings, could still get the good word. Now, back in the East, you had the revivals that were sweeping through the schools, through the colleges, and they spread beyond. Charles Finney became one of the major preachers during this. He worked particularly in Western New York. He swept back and forth so often that they referred to it as the burned over district. The religious fire had swept the country. During the winter of 1830 to 1831, he converted over 100,000 people in 6 months. He was a awesome speaker. They practiced collective conversion, where it wasn't just you. People were invited up to the doubters bench, and then their family and friends would gather around them and help them pray it through until they were converted. So it wasn't just you up there by yourself. And all of this religious fervor is going to lead to other things, like social reform. And I've only got 4 things up here: alcoholism, prostitution, war, slavery. But it's going to go way beyond that. Finley is going to be chosen to head Oberlin College. We're going to talk about Oberlin College a little bit later. Oberlin College was founded by 2 men who were abolitionists, and they chose Finney because of his anti-slavery beliefs. Oberlin College was the first college that admitted women and blacks. Even though women were admitted, they were still, you couldn't talk out in class, you couldn't recite at graduation, but they let you in. The other, one of the other, I mean, there are lots of sects, and some people would call them cults, coming up at this time. There is a lot of emotionalism going through the country at this time, a lot of spiritualism, and we're just talking about the major religious movements, but there are some others. One other that comes out of this time is a religion that is truly an American religion, Mormonism, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It is started by a man named Joseph Smith, who, as a teenager in 1820, claims that he has seen both God and Christ. In 1823, he says he is visited by an angel, Moroni, who is the son of Mormon, who is a prophet. And this angel shows Smith some golden tablets. And these golden tablets contain the words of a missing gospel of the Bible, the Book of Mormon. And every year, it was like some date in September, every year the angel would come back, they would talk, he would show Smith the tablets, and finally in 1827, Moroni allows Smith to keep the tablets so that he can transcribe them. But they're written in code, and he has to use special seer stones to read them, but he translates this into a 588-page book. Don't know how big these tablets were. And they were gold, so they had to be heavy. But he translates this into this Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon contains a lot of the King James Bible. And it's published in 1830. And he declares himself the leader of this new religion. He dismisses all other Christian denominations as false. Mormons he denies that there is a hell, and promises that a second coming is coming soon. And soon he has thousands and thousands of converts, mostly poor white New England farmers. And I think I failed to say he is in New England, like upstate New York, I think. The religion opposes slavery. Again, it rejects original sin for the goodness of humanity. And the church starts to grow. And it grows into a close-knit community full of rituals, righteousness, and they refuse to abide by local laws because Smith said that they didn't have to, that the church was above civil law. They deny the legitimacy of civilian government and the Constitution. This was a problem. Nobody wants a community like that in their area. So they moved from New York to Ohio, from Ohio to Missouri, from Missouri to a Mississippi town of Commerce, Illinois, which they to a Mississippi River town. Sorry, not a Mississippi town, a Mississippi River town, which they promptly renamed Nauvoo, which was happy place, I think. I can't remember what his definition was. The biggest thing that they did that Smith did that the neighbors didn't like was embrace polygamy. Smith had like over a dozen wives. And even people within the church, even one of Smith's wives, objected to this polygamy idea. Eventually, neighboring towns attacked this new town of Nauvoo. They tried to destroy the paper. In one of these attacks in June of 1844, Joseph and Hiram Smith are killed. Hiram is Smith's brother. And Brigham Young becomes their new leader. Brigham Young can see the writing on the wall that nobody wants them in the United States. So he promises Illinois that they're going to leave, and they head west. They leave Illinois for what will become Utah, At this point, it is part of Mexico. Unfortunately for him, it's not going to be part of Mexico for very long. They get out there in 1847. By 1848, they've created an oasis in the desert that they call Deseret. But we fight the Spanish-American War. Not the Spanish-American War. We fight the war with Mexico. And the United States ends up owning all of that territory. But they're far enough out that no one really cares. So for about 20 years, they're going to have independence. By 1869, there's about 80,000 Mormons in Utah, and they're happily out there converting the Indians. So you have all this religion floating around. Along with this religious movement, oh, is that the same slide? Yes. Okay. You have an intellectual movement, much like with the First Great Awakening. You have the Enlightenment. But this movement is a little bit different. This is Romanticism. And it's a movement in the United States and Europe. And it kind of is a reaction to the Enlightenment. It stresses the spirit and the heart over dry logic. The idea that there are things that science can't define. And it is a movement of art, literature, and thought. But it's going to continue this idea of individualism that the churches are now pushing, because if you say that individuals can get salvation through their own accord, you're pushing individualism. It also relies on the virtue of common people, and it stresses the creative genius of the artist. Immanuel Kant, who was a German philosopher, defined the movement in his book called Critique of Pure Reason, which shows the limits of science and reason in explaining the universe. So definitely not a deist, because he says there are other things that are going to, that you just can't explain. Things like conscience and beauty, religious impulses. People will do things for religion that make no logical sense. Love. People will do things for love that don't make logical sense. It's hard to explain love. That there were impulses that were too strong to be dismissed. And they elevate intuition over rational thought. And this is going to give rise to a whole another movement that is really, it's big worldwide, but it's really big in the United States, and that's transcendentalism. I really like transcendentalism. Transcendentalism is I think, a very neat concept. These were the most intense proponents of this rationalism. And the hotbed of transcendentalism centered in New England. And they emphasized the things that rise above the limits of reason. Like I said, this is a reaction against rationalism. It's also a reaction against Calvinist doctrine. And one of the big leaders, Ralph Waldo Emerson, was supposed to be a congregational minister, but gave that idea up. They kind of go closer to this idea of the Quakers and an inner light. They believe you have this inner light, this gift of God, that people refer to as intuition, and that everyone has this spark if they can just figure it out. This group had an unusually influential impact beyond its size. They stressed the right of individuals to interpret their life in their own way. So Ralph Waldo Emerson, and this is going to affect literature. America is about to have, and we're going to talk about, a literary like deluge, basically, that comes out of this. Ralph Waldo Emerson was supposed to be a Unitarian minister. He was the acknowledged leader of the Transcendentalists. His father was he came from a long line of ministers, but he put that idea aside to stress this new idea of transcendentalism. He wrote several essays, one called The American Scholar, which urged American college students to put aside their awe of European greatness and focus on what they could do as Americans. Then he wrote another one that was well received by students called Self-Reliance, which stressed individualism and independence. Now, the poster child for transcendentalism was Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau was a friend and neighbor of Emerson. He actually lived with him for a while. Thoreau is not a very successful man in terms of making money and making a living, but he didn't care. That wasn't his focus. He focused on living deliberately. This whole transcendentalist idea it's going to come back, but it's not really going to be called transcendentalism. It's going to affect the social movements of the 60s. Martin Luther King Jr. is going to pull on these ideas when he does his movement. Mahatma Gandhi is going to use these ideas. But Thoreau is, like I said, Thoreau is the poster child. He lived transcendentalism. He practiced reflective self-reliance. He was the son of a pencil maker and a very strong-willed abolitionist mother. Father was a pencil maker. He's the one who wrote the line about, and I didn't write it down, that men walk to the beat of a different drummer. So if a man does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it's because he hears a different drummer. And Thoreau was hearing a whole different beat. He tries this out in July of 1845. He moves to a place on Emerson's property called Walden Ponds, and he lives there. And nature plays a big role in transcendentalism. Getting back to nature is part of their ideas. And he writes in his book about how he's living with nature, and he writes about how humans affect nature. Like the path from his cabin to the pond wasn't there when he started, but by walking it every day, you create a path. And that was an issue, because is that living with nature or is that changing nature? But he writes, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. And he lived his beliefs. So when the Mexican War breaks out, he refuses to pay his poll tax because technically, any tax you pay for the government to the government, even though it might be a minuscule part of that, is going to help pay for the war. And he didn't believe in war because transcendentalists, that was one of the things they didn't believe in. And he believed that if a law was wrong, it was your duty to break it. So he's jailed for not paying his poll tax. His aunt, who was probably highly embarrassed, pays it for him. He's let out of jail. But out of that becomes one of his best essays on civil disobedience. The civil disobedience is what is going to later come back in the 1960s, this idea. But it's also going to affect American literature. And there is an outpouring at this time of extraordinary literature. And these people would get together and meet and discuss all of these highfalutin ideas. Out of this time period, you're going to get Nathaniel Hawthorne. You're going to get Emily Dickinson, Edgar Allan Poe, Walt Whitman, Herman Melville. All of these writers are going to come out of this time period, as well as the poets. Oh, sorry, I hurt my toe and I just kicked the desk. Give me a second. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Whittier, Oliver Wendell Holmes, sorry. James Russell Lowe. I put Walt Whitman up with the literary giants. Walt Whitman is a poet who is going to just shock the snot out of everybody with some of his themes. But Hawthorne couldn't quite get past his Puritan soul. He writes on themes of sin and consequences, pride and selfishness. Hawthorne's one that wrote The Scarlet Letter. Y'all are all familiar with The Scarlet Letter, right? I know that one people still have to read that. Those are the type of books he wrote. He wrote on secret guilt and the impossibility of rooting out sin from the human soul. Emily Dickinson was a poet. She was very original, also very elusive. She was a recluse, stayed in her home. She never married. She probably had fallen in love, but with a married man who was also a minister, which was not going to happen. That was very forbidden. She wrote on life, death, fear, loneliness, nature, God, and most of her works are published after her death. Edgar Allan Poe is probably one you're also familiar with. He was born in Boston but raised in Virginia. Poe believed that fear was the most intense emotion, and that by appealing to fear, making it real for your readers, he could move people. He's the father of the Gothic horror and of the detective story, and he judged prose by its ability to provoke emotional response. Herman Melville, he gets bigger after his death, but he does okay. He was a New Yorker who had gone to sea as a youth, had some great adventures, jumped ship in the South Seas. He was on a whaling ship. He jumped ship in the South Seas, lived with the natives for a while, wrote about that. Of course, he's mostly known for writing Moby Dick. We'll stop with Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman, like I said, was a most provocative writer. His book of poetry probably caused more outrage in the United States than any other printed text. He explored homoerotic themes. He wasn't overtly blunt, but he didn't hide the sexual references either. Leaves of Grass is the book that came out. but these authors are bringing out things that haven't been discussed. And you've also got to remember, we're still a very young country. I mean, it hasn't even been 100 years since the revolution. We don't have a literary background. We don't have great writers. We don't have a literary history. And so these people are creating that. They're creating an American literature that really didn't exist. And I'm not saying people didn't write. Washington Irving kind of attempted to create a national past with Rumpelstiltskin and some of his, the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. But we don't have a Shakespeare or, the Greek writers. We don't have that background. We don't have a lot. So this is starting to create an American background. All right, we will stop. We will start with newspapers next time. I'll leave the test open till 5, and I will see y'all on Wednesday. I can't remember what day it is.
Actually, leave it like 6. I'll work in between classes all the way up. I'll leave it the paper?
Sign in?
Yes. Have a good day.
You too.
Oh, I need to sign in. Sorry.
That's all right.